I'm Michelle Ferguson, and so glad that you tuned in today. Today, I really wanted to talk about in the enemy's camp. Have you ever just been in a situation where you just feel like you're facing just one thing after the other? I know sometimes life can really just bring you to the place where you can feel alone, or you can feel like you're just dealing with so much stuff that's so much bigger than you are. Well, I wanted to kind of spend this podcast talking about David and Goliath. This is a very, very familiar story to a whole lot of people. You can find it in 1 Samuel 16 and 1 Samuel 17. But one of the interesting things that I found was, of course, if you don't know the story, in this story, David is in a position where he finds himself going up against Goliath. And not just any Goliath, a Goliath that no one else wanted to face. Here are the children of Israel. They're at war with the Philistines, and Goliath is this super tall champion of theirs who's proven. And they're so confident in their champion that he's kind of coming before the entire army saying, send someone out. I'm going to beat whoever you send out. And when I do, I'm going to take over your whole everything. Israel was in danger of losing everything. This would have had an effect not just on the army, but on all the children, all the wives, the future, the kingdom. And so here's David, and he's facing a giant. And the funny thing is, he wasn't even a part of the army, but yet he's facing the giant. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, one of the things I wanted to kind of start with was that when, verse 42, when David finally comes out, Goliath sees David, and Goliath starts to scorn him. He's looking at him. It said that the Bible says that he had disdain for him because he was a youth and he was ruddy and of a fair countenance. And if you ever been through anything, you already know that sometimes your giants, your mountains, your situations, they can talk to you. And I find it so interesting that the first thing that the giant says in response to him is all the things that were negative about him. You're too young. You don't look the part. David came out without any armor. He didn't come out with all of his weapons, all of these sorts of things. And here he is, pretty much by himself, facing this giant. The giant goes on to tell him, if you keep reading, he's kind of like, not only am I going to destroy you, I'm going to cut off your head, I'm going to feed it to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the fields, and he's just really kind of boasting. And David comes back, which is what I think is really interesting. In verse 46, he says, this day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. The interesting thing here that I really wanted to kind of point out was two things. Number one, here is the giant talking to David, telling him all the things that he's going to do. And the funny thing is when David finally opened up his mouth and started talking, he didn't even recreate the words. He just took what the enemy was coming and saying against him and reversed it on the enemy. And sometimes that's what we got to learn to do. Is that, sickness and disease comes to tell you that it's going to debilitate you, that it's going to knock you out, that it's going to cut your life short, that it's going to remove you from the things that you love. Lack and dissension comes into your house to tell you that you're nothing, to tell you that you don't have what it takes. And sometimes you got to just take those very words that the giant is trying to communicate to you and turn it around and tell that sickness and disease, no, I'm going to cut you off at the knees and I'm going to throw you out of my house. No, your life will be shortened because you're not going to be able to live in my life. What you say to dissension and lack and all those things that try and come against you is that you speak against those things and tell it where to go. But I think what's interesting is that when David, when he starts speaking back to Goliath, have you ever noticed that he said, I'm going to smite you and take your head from you? Now, if you've read this story before, you know that David showed up in this battle with a slingshot and some stones. What part of a slingshot and or stones is going to be able to remove somebody's head? When Goliath put that threat out to David, he was talking about cutting off his head. David didn't have a sword. And the interesting thing is, even before he went to battle, Saul came to him, and Saul was like, okay, first of all, Saul told him, the king of Israel, he told him, number one, you can't win this battle, but I'm going to let you wear my armor in the process. So David tried on his armor. Now you have to think about this. The king's armor had to be just vast. I mean, I would dare say he had the best that could be made. And in fact, Saul was a very, 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 very large man. And so he was very tall. And so I'm sure that his armor was made for him, custom made for him. I mean, if you kind of go back, you probably can see, if you think back to it, you can probably see and imagine just all the measurements that were taken, that his sword was built to fit his hand and his shield and everything. All of this of a champion was built for the king. And so sure, shouldn't that fit David? Well, if you read on, it didn't fit David. And sometimes this is why we don't get as far as we're supposed to do, because we're trying to take everybody else's gifts and make it fit on us. As great as Saul's armor was, it was not proven by David. It was not made for David, and therefore David could not use it. And I just want to say this to you. If you're one of those people where you find yourself in a state of wishing, you ever just been there where you wish you could sing like someone else, or you wish that you were a little bit quieter like this person over here, or you wish you were just born to another family, or you wish that you had the ability to have this education or that education, or you wish you can go back and change, the clock. I want to submit that to you today, is to let all that go, because God has something for you specifically. He's a God who maximizes on details. Sometimes we find ourselves in a position where we don't. And I recently got married, and one of the things, it's been a great ride. And one of the things I've really learning as a newly married woman is just the difference between how detailed women are versus men. And I really think that my husband is really good at being detailed. But I noticed that there are times, one time I came in and I got my hair done and I put some extra hair in there and changed the color a little bit. And actually not a little bit, a lot. I put blonde in it. I came in the door and, he was just kind of looking at me like, and I could tell he knew that there was a difference, but he didn't know what that difference was. And so he kind of kept looking and he was kind of like, what's different? And I'm sitting there like, I left here with black hair. I'm coming home with blonde streaks. How do you not recognize that? And eventually I had to tell him, but I learned very quickly that sometimes with men, they're not as detailed. Well, God is detailed. So he not only notices the changes, he notices what needs to change in your life, what needs to be made available to you in your life for what you're facing in your future. So David's in here with a slingshot. He gets to the place, if you keep reading, he uses that slingshot. He hits Goliath in the head. Goliath falls to the ground. But wait a minute. Most of us stop there and think, okay, that's the end of the story. But that's not where the story ended. David has said to Goliath that I'm going to take your head. But he had no sword. He had no sword. And even though he had seen the manifestation of God in the ability of the slingshot and how this little bitty rock had taken down a giant, he was still in a battle without seemingly everything that he needed. Now, if you keep reading, David did grab a sword, but the sword that he grabbed was not the one that Saul tried to give him. It was the sword that was with Goliath. And when I first thought about that, I'm like, there's so many things that had to happen for him to be able to pick up that sword. Number one, the sword was made for Goliath. He is the champion of the Philistines. If you think about all of the craftsmen and all the people behind the scenes who probably fought to be the one to make Goliath's sword, how many people were fighting for that honor? Measuring his hand to make sure that it fit his hand well, that he could execute properly. How many years in the making was this? How many people were involved in making the sword for a champion? The interesting thing is that while all of those people in the Philistine camp felt like they were putting all of their energies into making something for a champion, Goliath, what they didn't realize was all of their hard work, their blood, sweat, and tears was really being made for God's champion, which was David. So I want to say to you who feel like, I can't step out. I can't do anything more than I'm doing because I don't feel like I have everything that I need. Sometimes your provision is actually in the enemy's camp. If David had never stood up in courage and actually went after Goliath, he would have never realized all of the things that God had for him. And then to go even a little bit further is Goliath was a giant, bigger than Saul. And remember, David couldn't fit Saul's armor because it was too big. It was too much. It was too heavy. So why would Goliath's sword be any different? In fact, his sword would most likely be heavier and bigger because if it's made for his hand and this giant is over 9 feet tall, you can imagine how large his hands are. So how is it that a young shepherd boy could pick up such a heavy sword? Because when it was time for him, God gave him everything he needed to be able to lift even that which he should not be able to do in the natural. Take the limits off of God and what he can do in your life. Stop looking at the circumstances and telling yourself that you're not qualified or that you don't have what it takes. When you're on God's side, he'll give you everything you need to be able to execute everything you're supposed to execute. And even in the face of great pressure, like what David was dealing with, national disaster, national pressure here, people looking on him, everything's on his shoulders. Even in the midst of that, even in front of naysayers, people who were laughing at David, Goliath who was laughing at David, David who comes out there unprepared. God has set up everything he needed in the enemy's camp. God used David to solve a national crisis, to win a national war, and he wasn't even in the army. I want to submit to you today, as I'm wrapping this up, that if you look around in our society, there's so many things that are going wrong. You know, sometimes I just have to turn off the news because you wake up and you've got this disaster over here and you've got this earthquake over here. You've got all of this shooting over here. You've got all of these issues. And sometimes I just feel like it's just too big. Sometimes it's just easy to sit back and look at life and take it as an observer. I want to challenge you to get in the race because just like God can use a young shepherd boy to solve a national issue, if you let him use you right where you are, he'll surprise you. The Bible talks about that the creature is waiting for the manifestations of the sons of God. You are important. You are called, and God has a plan and mission for you. So get him out of a box and watch him lead you and help you be the best you that you can be this day. I pray that you enjoyed today's podcast, and I want to encourage you to share with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe at michelleferguson.org. It's Michelle Ferguson, helping you to discover, develop, and celebrate who God created you to be.